Hi, everyone, and welcome back. This week, we're talking about a part of recovery that is both frustrating and confusing. Why is it that the harder we try to quit, the more we seem to binge? If you've ever sworn off processed foods only to end up eating more than ever before, you know exactly how painful this can be. You wake up one morning determined, promising yourself, that's it, I'm done, never again. And maybe for a day or two, you stick with it. You feel proud, even strong, but then the cravings begin. At first, it's just a whisper, maybe just one bite. But then the voice grows louder. You've had a stressful day. You deserve this. You can start again tomorrow. The pressure builds until it feels unbearable. And before you know it, you're in the middle of a binge, eating more of the very food you swore off than you ever would have otherwise. And afterwards, there's shame, frustration, that sinking thought, what is wrong with me? Why can't I just stop? And the next morning, the cycle starts all over again with an even stricter vow. This isn't just bad habit. This is the binge restrict cycle, a loop fueled by the way addiction hijacks the brain. And the cruelest part is that it makes us blame ourselves for what is, in fact, the predictable result of pressure on a brain that's been rewired by processed foods. So, in this session, we're going to look at why restriction backfires, how the brain interprets never again as a survival threat, and how a gentler, slower approach can help you eliminate processed foods without triggering the spiral of binging. We'll talk about the neuroscience, dopamine, survival tagging, cortisol, and the prefrontal cortex. So you can see clearly that this isn't weakness, it's addiction. And then we'll explore what actually does work, lowering pressure, building safety, and moving at a pace the brain can accept. Because recovery isn't about perfection, it's about stability, it's about freedom that lasts. Let's take a closer look at what so many of us know as the binge restrict cycle. This is one of the most discouraging and confusing experiences in recovery because on the surface, it looks like you're sabotaging yourself. But when we pull back the curtain and really study it, we can see that it's not about weakness or lack of discipline. It's about how the addicted brain responds to threat. Here's how the cycle usually unfolds. It starts with restriction. Maybe you wake up one morning and you tell yourself, that's it, I'm done. I'll never eat this food again. It feels empowering at first. You've drawn a hard line. And you're convinced that this time it's going to stick. You may even feel a little lighter, like the decision itself has created a sense of relief. But then something begins to happen underneath the surface. The brain doesn't just hear the words, never again. It interprets those words as a signal of deprivation, of loss, even of danger. Because remember, when you've been eating processed foods regularly, your brain has tagged those foods as important for your survival. This is not just a metaphor. In neuroscience, we call it survival tagging. Dopamine, the brain's motivation chemical, is designed to help us remember what keeps us alive. It's the same system that makes us want to eat when we're hungry or reach for water when we're thirsty. In a healthy brain, dopamine gently nudges us toward behaviors that support life. But in an addicted brain, processed foods have been artificially tagged as if they were oxygen. So when you say never again, the survival brain hears something very different. We are about to cut off a vital source of survival. Immediately, alarm bells start ringing. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, fires off signals that something essential is being taken away. This triggers the release of cortisol, the body's main stress hormone. Your heart rate might increase, your thoughts may speed up, and the cravings suddenly feel much more urgent. Now you're in the second step of the cycle, craving pressure. At first, it feels like a whisper, a little voice saying, "Are you sure you want to quit? Don't you deserve just a taste?" But as the hours go by, the voice gets louder. Thoughts circle endlessly. Maybe just today. Maybe after this stressful week. Maybe one last time. What you're experiencing is not indecision. It's the clash between two brain systems. The prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, is saying, "I don't want this anymore." But the deeper survival circuits, lit up by dopamine and stress hormones, are shouting, "We need this right now, or we won't be safe." It feels like a tug of war inside your own head. Eventually, the pressure becomes overwhelming, and that's when the binge happens. You give in. You eat the very food you promised yourself you would never touch again. And for a brief moment, the relief is real. The amygdala quiets down, cortisol drops, the brain says, "Crisis averted, we're safe again." But then, almost immediately, regret sets in. You're left with the third stage of the cycle, shame and confusion. You think, "Why did I do that? I wanted so badly to change. What's wrong with me?" The binge that was meant to silence the alarm ends up feeding the very despair that triggered it in the first place. And then, like clockwork, the cycle starts again. You wake up the next morning disgusted with yourself and make even a stricter vow: "I'm really going to quit this time. I'll be perfect. I'll never slip again," which only sets the stage for the same pattern to repeat. Now, here's the important thing to understand. This cycle is not your fault. It is not a sign that you're weak or broken. It's the predictable result of how the addicted brain reacts to threat. Restriction triggers alarm. Alarm fuels cravings. Cravings lead to binging, and binging resets the cycle with shame. Think about it like this. If you hold your breath underwater, your body doesn't politely wait until you decide to come up for air. It fights back. Your chest tightens, your lungs burn, your whole body convulses until you finally gasp for breath. That gasp isn't a failure of willpower. It's a survival instinct. The binge restrict cycle works the same way. The harder you clamp down, the louder the survival brain screams. The binge isn't weakness, it's the gasp for air. It's the brain's attempt to shut off the alarm and restore a sense of safety. So when you look at it this way, the real problem isn't that you lack discipline. The real problem is the cycle itself and the misunderstanding of how the brain works. We've been taught to believe that restriction is the path to freedom. But the truth is, restriction fuels the very binging we're trying to escape. So what's the alternative? Instead of fighting the brain with pressure, we learn to calm it with safety. Instead of saying never again, we say, I have time. I can go slowly. I can make one change at a time. This reassures the survival brain, lowers cortisol, and keeps dopamine from spiraling out of control. That's why we emphasize gentleness in our community. It's not about being easy on yourself or lowering standards. It's about working with your brain instead of against it. Safety first, then change. Calm first, then elimination. Because when the brain feels safe, the cravings lose their urgency and the binge restrict cycle begins to unravel. So let's hold on to this. If you've been caught in the cycle, it's not proof of failure. It's proof of how powerful this addiction is and how deeply it rewires the brain. And it's also proof that the solution isn't more pressure, but more safety instead. That's the path out of the loop. We've named the binge restrict cycle and we've seen how it unfolds. Restriction, craving pressure, binge, shame, and repeat. But to really understand why this happens, we need to look more closely at what restriction does to the addicted brain. Because on the surface, restriction seems logical. If something is hurting us, the rational step would be to cut it out completely. That's how we handle a lot of problems. If a stove burns us, we stop touching it. If a relationship is toxic, we leave. But when it comes to processed foods, the brain has been so deeply rewired by addiction that restriction doesn't just mean stop doing something harmful. It feels at the survival level like losing something necessary for life. And here's why. When we eat processed foods, the brain is hit with an artificially large release of dopamine, the chemical that signals importance and reward. Normally, dopamine is released in small amounts when we do things that are good for us, like eating natural foods, connecting with people, completing a task. That small surge says, this matters. Remember this. Do it again sometime. But processed foods hijack the system because they combine concentrated sugar, flour, fats, and chemical additives. They create a dopamine flood far beyond what nature ever intended. The brain takes notice. It begins to tag these foods as important, not just pleasant, not just enjoyable, but essential. Over time, the brain literally rewires to treat them as if they were oxygen. This is what I mean by survival tagging. So when you say never again, I'll cut this food out completely, the prefrontal cortex, the rational goal setting part of the brain, may feel proud and determined. But the deeper survival driven circuits hear a very different message. They hear, we're about to lose a vital resource. Our survival is under threat. And the brain does what brains do when survival feels threatened. It sounds the alarm. That alarm begins in the amygdala, the almond shaped cluster deep in the brain that constantly scans for danger. The amygdala doesn't care about logic. It cares about safety. And once it's activated, it sends out urgent distress signals. Your body floods with cortisol and adrenaline. Your thoughts race. Your attention narrows. And suddenly, cravings don't feel like mere suggestions anymore. They feel like emergencies. This is why restriction leads to obsession. You might try to cut something out, but suddenly you're thinking about it more than ever. Every time you pass it at the store, every time you see someone else eating it, the cravings roar. That's not because you're weak willed. That's because your amygdala is firing survival alarms and your whole system is flooded with stress chemistry. Think of it like trying to sleep while a smoke alarm is going off in your house. You can't just will yourself to rest. Your body won't let you. It thinks the situation is dangerous. Restriction activates that same kind of alarm system in the addicted brain. Now, you might be wondering, what about the rational part of the brain? The prefrontal cortex is supposed to help us stick to our goals. It's the part of the brain that makes long term plans, resists impulses, and says, I don't want this anymore. Here's the problem. When the amygdala alarm is blaring, the prefrontal cortex gets drowned out. Survival circuits are faster, louder, and more powerful. Neuroscientists sometimes describe it as amygdala hijack. The logical voice is still there, but it's been shoved into the background while the emergency signals take over. And that's why you can promise yourself all day long, I'm done, I'm not going to do it. And then you find yourself in the kitchen at 10 p.m. eating something you swore you wouldn't touch. It's not that your promise disappeared. It's that your survival brain pulled the fire alarm and silenced the reasoning part of you. This is also why the binge itself feels, for a brief moment, like relief. When you finally give in and eat the restricted food, the amygdala alarm shuts off, cortisol drops, and the survival brain says, crisis over, we're safe again. Of course, that relief doesn't last. Within minutes or hours, shame and regret flood in. But for that fleeting moment, the binge did exactly what the survival brain wanted it to do. It ended the alarm. So when we look at it through the lens of neuroscience, the binge isn't weakness or self sabotage. It's the brain's desperate attempt to restore safety after restriction lit up the alarm system. And here's another layer: denial. Because the brain has tagged processed foods as survival essential, it doesn't just sound alarms when they're threatened. It also generates thoughts to protect access to them. That's the addictive voice, the one that says, it's not that bad. Everyone eats this. You can start tomorrow. You've had a hard day. You deserve it. These thoughts aren't random. They're the brain's way of ensuring that you don't cut off what it believes is necessary for survival. So when you restrict, you don't just face cravings and stress. You also face a flood of persuasive, soothing arguments designed to pull you back in. This is why restriction backfires on multiple levels. It lights up the alarm system, it increases stress, and overrides the logical brain, and it empowers the addictive voice to shout even louder. So, why does all this science matter? Because it changes how we view ourselves. When we know the brain science, we can stop blaming ourselves for the binge. You stop calling yourself weak or broken. You stop believing the lie that if you just had more willpower, you could stick to restriction. You begin to see that restriction itself is the problem, not because you're flawed, but because your brain has been rewired by addiction. And once you understand that, you can start to choose a different approach. Instead of force, you choose gentleness. Instead of restriction, you choose safety. Instead of pressuring yourself into never again, you reassure yourself with, I have time, I can go slowly. And when you do that, the amygdala alarm quiets, cortisol lowers, the cravings lose their urgency, the addictive voice becomes easier to recognize, and elimination begins to feel possible, not because you forced it, but because your brain no longer believes it's under attack. So let's hold on to this. Restriction backfires because it turns recovery into a survival threat. It activates alarms, floods the body with stress, silences logic, and fuels the very binges we're trying to avoid. The solution isn't to fight harder. The solution is to remove the sense of threat, to create calm, safety, and stability, the conditions under which the addicted brain can finally begin to heal. Up to this point, we've talked about why restriction backfires, why cravings can feel like emergencies, and how binges temporarily shut off the survival alarm. Now we're ready to ask a new question. If pressure and speed lead to binges, then what actually does work? The answer may surprise you because it goes against so much of what we've been taught by diet culture, self help books, and even by our own desperate inner voices. The answer is slowing down. In our community, we call this approach Team Snail. And while it might sound small or even silly at first, the science behind it is solid. Moving slowly, one gentle step at a time, is not weakness. It's a way of working with your brain instead of against your brain. It's a strategy that calms the survival system, lowers cravings, and makes elimination sustainable. Let's start by naming why fast feels so tempting. When we're stuck in the binge restrict cycle, the pain is intense. The shame is heavy. We feel desperate for relief. In that desperation, the idea of quick, sweeping change is seductive. If I just cut everything out at once, I'll finally be free. If I lose the cravings fast, the pain will end. Diet programs exploit this desperation. They promise rapid transformation. They hand out lists of forbidden foods and reassure us that if we just follow the rules strictly enough, everything will get better. But neuroscience shows us that this doesn't work. Quick, harsh elimination doesn't calm the addicted brain. It provokes it. It lights up the amygdala, floods the body with cortisol, and pushes us straight back into the cycle of binging. Fast feels good for a moment because it matches our urgency. But it doesn't lead to freedom, it leads to collapse. Now let's flip the script. What happens when we go slowly? When you approach elimination one small step at a time, the survival brain doesn't register threat. It doesn't hear, we're cutting off oxygen. It hears something more like, we're safe, we're okay, we're making gentle adjustments. From a neuroscience perspective, this matters for two reasons. Number one, the amygdala stays quiet. No survival alarm. Without the alarm, cortisol doesn't flood the system, and cravings don't reach emergency levels. Number two, the prefrontal cortex stays online. When stress is low, the logical goal setting part of the brain can stay in charge. That means you can make thoughtful decisions, follow through on gentle boundaries, and actually experience success. Slowness is not about lowering standards. It's about protecting the brain's ability to cooperate with your goals. Think about it like this. If you were building a house, you wouldn't start by ripping down walls before the foundation was poured. You'd start by creating a stable base. Recovery works the same way. Before you remove, you add safety. You strengthen your community connections. You build routines that calm your nervous system. You practice affirmations that remind you, I have all the time I need. I am safe in this process. When safety is established, elimination doesn't feel like loss. It feels like a natural next step. And because the brain is calm, the change actually sticks. There's a biological principle here that's worth naming. The brain loves stability. Neurons fire in patterns. The more stable the pattern, the stronger it becomes. When you move slowly, you're giving your brain time to create new stable patterns. Patterns that say, I can live without this. I can feel safe without that food. When you move too quickly, the patterns don't have time to form. The brain panics, reverts to old wiring, and drags you back into the binge. So when we say Team Snail, we're really saying give your brain the time it needs to build new, stable wiring. Let me bring this into lived experience because this isn't just theory. Many of us have tried to go fast, maybe dozens of times. We've made bold declarations. Starting Monday, no more sugar, no more flour, no more anything. We've cleaned out our kitchens in one dramatic sweep, determined that this time would be different. And then what happened? For a day or two, maybe we felt strong, but then the cravings roared. Stress built. The survival alarm screamed louder, and by the end of the week, sometimes even by the end of the day, we were in a binge worse than before. Now compare that to the slower path. Maybe you choose one small change. Maybe you said, for now, I'll keep this food out of my house, or I'll pause on this one item during the work week. No pressure, no never again vows, just one gentle adjustment supported by community. At first, it may have felt almost too small to matter. But here's the magic. Because your brain wasn't in alarm mode, the change stuck. You felt a little safer, a little stronger. That one change gave you confidence to try another. Over time, those small, slow steps added up to something massive, a lifestyle, a new identity. This is why so many people in this community can look back and say, the slower I went, the further I got. Diet culture tells us speed is strength, but neuroscience tells us stability is strength. Think about learning any new skill, playing an instrument, learning a language, training for a marathon. If you push too hard, too fast, you burn out. But if you go slowly, consistently, patiently, you build mastery that lasts. Recovery is the same. Every time you make a gentle change and it sticks, you strengthen your brain's new wiring. Every time you practice calmness instead of pressure, you reinforce safety. That is what leads to long-term freedom. Slowness isn't weakness. Slowness is how the brain actually changes. And of course, this isn't something that we do alone. In our community chats, you'll hear people celebrating tiny wins. I closed the cupboard today. I paused before acting on a craving. I reminded myself I have all the time I need. These may sound small, but in community, they are recognized for what they are, powerful steps of rewiring. When you share your Team Snail wins and hear someone else say, me too, it reinforces the truth. Small is big. Slow is strong. Gentle is sustainable. So let's hold on to this. The addicted brain interprets restriction as threat. Speed fuels panic. Pressure fuels binges. But when we slow down, when we move with the patience of Team Snail, the brain calms. Safety comes first. The prefrontal cortex stays online, and changes stick. This isn't a race. Recovery isn't about who gets there fastest. It's about who builds stability that lasts a lifetime. And stability grows not from pressure, but from gentleness, from slowness, from the courage to go at the brain's pace instead of diet culture's pace. That's why Team Snail works. It may look slow from the outside, but on the inside, it's building something stronger than speed could ever give you. Freedom that lasts. We've seen how restriction fuels binges, how dopamine and cortisol combine to make cravings feel like emergencies, and how slowing down with Team Snail helps the brain feel safe. Now, let's get very practical. What can you actually do in daily life to calm the survival system, reduce pressure, and move forward gently? This is where gentle practices come in. They may seem simple on the surface, but they're rooted in neuroscience. These tools help retrain the brain by lowering threat signals and strengthening calm, stable pathways. We'll talk about 3 practices today: noticing restrict binge thoughts, using safety phrases, and imagining freedom. The first practice is simply noticing. For most of us, the restrict binge cycle is fueled not just by cravings in the body, but by scripts in the mind. These are the phrases the addictive voice uses to keep us stuck. Some of the most common are never again, I'll cut this out forever. Well, I already blew it, so I might as well finish the whole package. I'll start over tomorrow. These thoughts sound convincing because they appear to come from your own voice. But when you step back, you can see that they are predictable, repetitive patterns of the addiction itself. Neuroscience helps explain this. The brain uses shortcuts, automatic thought loops, to conserve energy. In addiction, those loops become distorted. The same thoughts replay over and over like a stuck record, pushing you back toward the addictive substance. So the practice here is to catch the thought and name it. You might say to yourself, oh, that's my addictive voice. That's the restrict binge script, not me. You don't need to argue with it. You don't need to fight it. Just naming it creates distance. It shifts activity from the emotional survival circuits into the prefrontal cortex, where you can see the thought more clearly. Some people find it helpful to actually write these phrases down in a notebook. When you see them on paper, they lose some of their power. You realize they're not unique or personal. They're the language of addiction, the same lines spoken in 1,000 different lives. The second gentle practice is using safety phrases. Remember, binges are driven by the brain's sense of threat. When the survival system thinks you're in danger of losing something essential, it floods you with cortisol and alarms. So the antidote is to send signals of safety. This is where short, calming phrases come in. You can think of them as verbal off switches for the alarm system. Some examples are, I have all the time in the world. Safety first, then change. I am calm. I am steady. I am not in danger. The slower I go, the further I get. At first, these may sound almost too simple, but repetition matters. Every time you say a calming phrase, you activate neural pathways in the prefrontal cortex and the vagus nerve, the part of the nervous system that signals relaxation. Over time, These phrases become conditioned cues. Your body starts to associate them with a drop in stress, much like a deep breath. They literally retrain your brain to respond differently to the thought of elimination. One community member described it this way: "At first, it felt silly to tell myself I have time. But after a few weeks, I noticed that the cravings didn't feel so urgent anymore. It was like my brain finally believed me. I really did have time. I didn't have to rush." The third gentle practice is using imagination. One of the most powerful features of the brain is that it responds to imagined experience almost as strongly as to the real experience. Athletes use visualization to train their bodies. Musicians rehearse in their minds and improve performance. In recovery, we can use the same principle to imagine freedom. Instead of picturing restriction, the foods you never eat again, the deprivation you'll face, picture the peace you're moving toward. Imagine yourself walking through a grocery store without being pulled by the aisles that used to tempt you. See yourself cooking a meal and feeling calm, not panicked. Picture waking up in the morning without food fog, your mind clear and steady. This isn't fantasy, it's mental rehearsal. Every time you imagine freedom, you strengthen the neural circuits that make that freedom more attainable. You give your brain a positive map to follow. And importantly, you keep the focus on what you're moving toward, not just what you're moving away from. The survival brain hates loss, but it responds well to vision. By imagining freedom instead of deprivation, you reduce the sense of threat and increase motivation for real change. Now, you might wonder, can something this simple really make a difference? The science says yes. Noticing thoughts engages the prefrontal cortex and interrupts automatic loops. This is similar to techniques used in cognitive neuroscience and mindfulness training, where awareness alone reduces the power of compulsive patterns. Safety phrases activate parasympathetic nervous system pathways. Studies show that repeating calming words or affirmations can lower cortisol and reduce activation in the amygdala. Visualization lights up the same brain circuits as real experience. Neuroscientists have documented that imagined practice strengthens neural pathways almost as effectively as real practice. So while these practices may seem small, they are actually powerful forms of brain training. Every time you use them, you are rewiring your brain away from pressure and towards safety. It's important to notice that none of these practices are about forcing change. They are not about willpower, discipline, or pressure. They are about gentleness. That's because gentleness is what calms the survival brain. It's what keeps the amygdala quiet, the cortisol low, the cravings manageable. Gentleness doesn't mean you're lowering your standards. It means you're creating the conditions under which real change is possible. Think of it like tending a garden. You can't make plants grow by yelling at them or pulling on the stems. You make them grow by giving them sunlight, water, and time. Recovery works the same way. You don't force it. You create the right conditions, and growth happens naturally. So let's hold on to this. Gentle practices are not extras. They are essential tools for calming the brain and breaking the binge restrict cycle. When you notice restrict binge thoughts, you take back perspective. When you use safety phrases, you signal your nervous system that there is no emergency. And when you imagine freedom, you give your brain a vision to lean toward instead of a threat to fight against. Each of these practices is simple, but together, repeated over time, They reshape your brain's response to elimination. They replace panic with peace, pressure with stability, and binges with real freedom. This is how Team Snail moves forward, not by force, but by gentle, consistent steps that rewire the brain for lasting recovery. As we close this week's session, let's step back and put everything we've covered into one clear picture. We began by naming the restrict binge cycle, that painful loop where the harder we try to quit, the more we end up binging. We saw how this isn't a matter of weak willpower or personal failure. It's the predictable outcome of how the addicted brain responds to threat. When we say never again, the brain doesn't hear discipline. It hears danger because processed foods have been survival tagged by dopamine floods. The amygdala interprets restriction as loss of something essential. Cortisol rises, stress builds, cravings turn into emergencies. Eventually, the binge happens, not because we're weak, but because the brain is trying to shut off the survival alarm. That's the cycle: restriction, alarm, binge, shame, round and around. And for so many of us, it has kept us trapped for years. But today, we've also seen why there is hope. Because once you understand the science, you can stop blaming yourself. You can see that this isn't about character flaws or lack of discipline. It's about the way addiction hijacks survival pathways in the brain. And once you know that, you can choose a different approach. The antidote to pressure is not more pressure, it's safety. When we move slowly, when we reassure ourselves with phrases like, I have time, the slower I go, the further I get, we quiet the amygdala. Cortisol levels drop. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that helps us stick to our goals, stays online. This is why Team Snail works. It's not about lowering standards. It's about creating the conditions under which the brain can heal. Fast change lights up alarms. Slow change builds stability. And stability is what makes recovery last. We also looked at practical ways to lower pressure in daily life. Noticing addictive thoughts and naming them for what they are. Using safety phrases to send calming signals to the nervous system. Imagining freedom instead of deprivation, so the survival brain sees hope instead of loss. Each of these practices is small, but none of them are trivial. Each one is a form of brain training. Every time you use them, you're shifting neural circuits away from alarm and toward safety. Over time, those gentle steps add up. The binge restrict cycle begins to unravel. So why does all this matter? Because it shows us a way out. For so long, we've been told the wrong story, that we should be able to quit through willpower, that relapse means weakness, that speed is the mark of success. But the real story is that recovery comes through safety, gentleness, and connection. Restriction fuels binges. Safety calms the brain. Slowness makes change last. Connection protects recovery. That's the path we're on. And over time, this path changes everything. What once felt impossible, walking past foods that used to call your name, living without food fog, feeling calm instead of desperate, becomes natural. What once felt like deprivation begins to feel like freedom. The addictive voice still whispers sometimes, but now you recognize it quickly. You know how to calm your system. You know how to reach for community, and the voice loses its power. This isn't about perfection. It's about progress that sticks. It's about building a lifestyle where you don't have to fight cravings every day because the cravings don't rule you anymore. So as you move into this week, remember, you don't need to pressure yourself. Pressure fuels the cycle. Safety breaks it. You don't need to rush. The slower you go, the steadier you become. You don't need to do this alone. Connection is what makes freedom possible. Every small, gentle step you take is progress. Every time you notice the addictive voice, every time you use a calming phrase, every time you connect with others in the community, you are rewiring your brain. You're building safety. You're moving further from the binge restrict cycle and closer to freedom. This isn't about fighting yourself. It's about caring for yourself. It's about giving your brain what it truly needs: calm, connection, and time. So let's carry that truth forward. Restriction backfires, safety heals. Team Snail wins the race. And together in community, we are stronger than the addictive voice. Recovery isn't about racing ahead. It's about building a steady, peaceful life that lasts. And step by step, with gentleness, that's exactly what we're doing. Thank you for listening.